The Art of Learning and Personal Development, Your Competitive Edge by Jim Stovall and Dr. Ray Hull. I'm your narrator, Rich Germain. Chapter 1. Learning About Learning, Jim Stovall. This book is definitely different from any of the previous 40 titles I've written, and it is quite probably very different from anything you've ever read. Virtually all nonfiction books are about learning something. This book is about learning itself. Everything known by us as individuals, or us collectively as a society, has been learned. Therefore, we can say all knowledge is a result of learning, but there is very little knowledge about learning. If we were to divide everything we have learned throughout our lives into two basic categories, these categories would be things we have learned through our formal education and things we have learned informally. This book is similarly divided, as I have written the odd-numbered chapters and my esteemed co-author Dr. Raymond Hull has written the even chapters. I am very pleased and privileged to once again be collaborating with Dr. Hull. We were introduced by a friend and colleague at the U.S. Department of Education, Joanne McCann. Our work seems totally dissimilar at first glance, but meshes beautifully upon further examination. Our previous co-authored titles include The Art of Communication and The Art of Presentation. While communication and presentation were complex and broad topics to reduce to writing, they pale in comparison to the vague and mysterious concept of learning. If we look at the prospect of formal learning, few people anywhere have had more experience as a student or a teacher than Dr. Hull. A brief glance at his credentials listed in this book will attest to his experience and expertise in formal learning. I, on the other hand, while proud of my college degree and university education, have learned most of what I know and share through my books, movies, syndicated columns, and speeches informally through a process we commonly refer to as life. Much learning comes from making mistakes and then becoming aware of how to overcome the same pitfall in the future. Mature learning can come from mistakes made by others and communicated to us directly or through our formal education. Some people can simply read about how long it takes paint to dry and then be empowered to avoid wet paint. Other people must be told by the painter to not touch the wet paint. And some of us don't get the message until we touch the wall and find our hand covered in wet paint. However we come by information and internalize it, learning is the process that elevates us all. If you want to get ahead in life and pursue what might be called success, there will inevitably be a great deal of learning required no matter what field of endeavor you might pursue. Similarly, we as a society emerged from the Stone Age and enjoy many modern miracles because of our combined and collective learning. Formal education allows us to begin our practical learning as we stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. Then we are equipped to launch out into our life's work with knowledge gained from previous generations. As an entrepreneur myself, I often write and give speeches about business. The whole world seems to be looking for one of those quantum leap ideas that can change the world and give them personal and financial success. The only thing required to have a great idea is to go through your daily routine, wait for something bad to happen, and ask yourself one simple question. How could I have avoided that? The answer to that question is invariably a great idea. The only thing required to turn your great idea you have learned experientially into a great business is to ask yourself one further question. How could I help other people avoid that problem? All great improvement, development, and success comes from solving problems and helping others to solve their problems. Problem solving is the end result of learning, and learning in the practical world comes from problem solving. When we learn something, we can change our lives. When we teach someone what we have learned, we can change their lives. But when we teach people to teach, we can change the whole world. One of the most vital activities in both your formal and informal education is learning through reading. If you were to examine the upward spiral of human development and progress throughout history, you would find that the advent of reading and the emergence of Gutenberg's printing press caused a great acceleration in human enlightenment. In our formal education, a huge milestone comes when we learn to read. Much of our early training and learning is directed toward this goal of learning to read. Once we have mastered the skill of reading, we are no longer learning to read, but spend the rest of our lives reading to learn. A great friend, mentor, and publisher of my first novel, Charlie Tremendous Jones, was fond of saying, "You will be the same person you are today 5 years from now, except for the people you meet and the books you read." Charlie was a voracious reader of biographies, which he believed to be simply another way of meeting more people. As a young boy, I remember a local TV show in my hometown that was hosted by a bookstore owner named Louis Meyer. Each week, Mr. Meyer would review several books and highlight others that were just coming into the market. He would end each program with his motto, "The more books you read, the taller you grow." Mr. Meyer continued to run his independent bookstore long past the age most people retire. I was pleased and honored when my first book came out and he featured it in his bookstore. If you will think back in your life about the handful of people who have been influential, you will likely discover that one or more of these influencers sparked a love or interest in reading in your life. As a best-selling author of over 40 books, 7 of which have been turned into movies, I am almost embarrassed to share with you, my readers, that when I could read books with my eyes, as you are doing at this moment, I rarely read a whole book cover to cover. As a totally blind person for the last quarter of a century, thanks to high-speed listening of audiobooks, I am pleased to report that I average reading 1 book each day. Becoming a reader has made me a writer and brought so many other things into my life, because reading is a foundation of learning. Traditionally, blind people like me or those with other barriers to the formal educational process were said to have a learning disability. In recent years, new research has emerged along with growing accessibility to education so that now an individual is said to have a learning difference. This is an important development in our society and quite possibly in your life. Gone are the days when we all had to learn the same thing in the same way at the same time. In the 21st century, whether you learn formally or informally, traditionally or non-traditionally, ahead or behind of people your age, it is only important that you learn. Curiosity is one of the most important components of our informal learning. There has never been a better time to be alive for those of us who have an insatiable curiosity and desire to learn than today. The Internet gives us instant access to collective knowledge. While it's important to realize that nothing on the Internet can be taken as an absolute fact, it is a great starting point for learning. In generations past, if you wanted to know the lifespan of a fruit fly, who played shortstop on the 1946 Yankees, or the length of the coastline of Alaska, you would have to spend several hours in the local library. Today, you simply need to utilize a device that is probably only a few feet away from you as you read these words. Today, there is almost no excuse for being ignorant of any fact or information, but having access to information and even retaining it in our memory does not mean we have learned it. To complete the cycle of learning, we must master the information and be able to apply it in the real world. Information can be learned and applied incorrectly, which can create a counterproductive or even a dangerous situation. Shortly after losing my sight, I received training in how to use a white cane to aid me in walking and navigating. One of my favorite destinations was a park near my house. I remember sitting on a bench one day, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air, when a father walked into the park with his kindergarten-aged son, who was struggling with a young puppy straining at its leash. I could clearly overhear the father explaining how they were going to begin training the dog to obey commands, such as come, sit, and stay. At his father's direction, The young boy released the puppy from the leash, at which point it proceeded to run with reckless abandon throughout the entire park. The father loudly called for the dog to come, but it ignored his commands for quite some time, until eventually the dog, near exhaustion, returned to the father and son and plopped down onto the ground in front of them. The father immediately took a rolled-up newspaper and began to hit the dog. This caused the young boy to burst into tears. Finally, the father turned to the son and asked, "Do you understand what we're teaching the dog?" The young boy responded through his tears, saying, "Yes, I understand that the dog has learned when he obeys your command and comes, you will hit him." The old proverb is true, that out of the mouths of babes can come great wisdom. Obviously, the father was not conveying the lesson he intended to teach either his son or the dog. We must learn the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Simply learning facts does not mean we understand them, and even if we understand them, we must apply them if we are to benefit from the learning process. If someone came into my office and informed me that the building was on fire, they have conveyed some information. If I hear their information and am able to process it and internalize it, I am now aware of the information. However, if I continue to sit in my office as the fire rages around me, it would be hard to say that any learning had taken place. Part of the ongoing learning process is becoming aware of things we have learned that must be relearned, recalibrated, or applied in new ways. In one of my previous books, The Millionaire Map, I outline my own journey from poverty to prosperity, as well as the journey of other wealthy and successful individuals. As a part of that book project, I developed an online millionaire profile that readers can take in order to get their own millionaire assessment. You'll find it on the web at themillionairemap.com. One of the key components to this millionaire assessment is a question dealing with original impressions and beliefs about millionaires. I believe that the greatest barriers to wealth and success are mental barriers. So until we can overcome facts that we may have learned that simply aren't true, we will be held back by this false learning. Many people believe that millionaires mostly inherit their money and are big winners in the gene pool lottery. In reality, the facts reveal that approximately 90% of millionaires are first generation and earn their money through means and avenues that are available to most of us. Many people believe the old myth that you have to have money to make money. Once again, the statistics show that most entrepreneurial ventures that result in people becoming millionaires begin with little or no capital. Many people believe that millionaires are greedy and dishonest. The statistics show that millionaires are as generous as the rest of the population, and the vast majority of millionaires play by the rules and have great integrity. If you are one of the many individuals who have false impressions about millionaires, you have to understand that in order to succeed, you must relearn and apply the new knowledge in the form of wisdom in order to succeed. This is not only important if you want to succeed financially, but in every field of endeavor. False learning, or learning that which is not true, is counterproductive and dangerous. Much bigotry and prejudice springs from this type of false learning. Anything you learn in your formal education must be demonstrable and repeatable in the real world. There was a time when the very best learning resulted in people believing that the world was flat and the sun revolved around the earth. In order for the scientific community to progress and move ahead, those facts had to be relearned and applied in the form of new knowledge on which we can continue to build the realm of understanding. Given the pace of technological advancement today, we must constantly question that which we have learned, because a formal education a decade old may be obsolete or even false. While I am convinced that a formal education can provide an important cornerstone to the value of learning, one of the dangers arises when we graduate. Too many people assume that graduation marks the end of education. While it may be the end of our formal education, It is the beginning of our lifelong education. Life itself is the greatest teacher we can ever have. A graduation ceremony is called a commencement. I believe it signals the beginning or commencing of our real-world informal learning adventure. My grandfather only had an 8th grade education, which during his time was an above-average formal education, but he was one of the most knowledgeable people I ever knew. He constantly read from one of the many volumes of encyclopedias he kept on a shelf near his favorite chair. My grandfather did not use the encyclopedia, like most people did, as a reference tool. He started with the first entry in the A volume and read through the last entry in the Z volume, and then began again. This gave him a broad overview of many things and introduced him to subjects he wanted to learn more about. No one with access to a local library or the Internet should ever stop learning. Throughout most of recorded history, people made a living based on what they could do. But here in the information age, we make a living and create success based on what we know. We should look upon learning much like we view making a deposit in the bank. When we put money into our account, our balance grows. And when we learn something, our knowledge and wisdom balance can be increased. The most famous person from my home state of Oklahoma, and arguably the most famous individual of his era, was Will Rogers. I featured Will Rogers in one of my homecoming historical novels and movies. Among the countless quotable statements he left us, the most enduring is the one etched in stone at his memorial site. "I never met a man I didn't like." I believe the same thing is true of books and all other learning resources. There are no subjects that are not valuable to learn about. People at the top of any field of endeavor know more than everyone else about a specific topic. Learning must become a habit. Whether you read books, access lectures, or watch documentaries, you must always be building your bank of knowledge via learning. This form of consistent learning will result in periodic quantum leaps I call enlightenment. When I was in the 4th grade, our class was struggling through the tedious process of learning fractions. Those in the field of formal education must realize that ignorance is not your enemy. Instead, boredom is your enemy. There are no subjects or topics that cannot be made to be absolutely fascinating, but in the 4th grade, I was struggling to learn fractions. Over many weeks, I was mystified by the entire concept. Then one afternoon, without warning, and for no particular reason I could discern, I got it. The accumulated information I had learned finally reached a critical mass, and I suddenly understood fractions. Thomas Edison said, "We don't know a millionth of 1% about anything." This points out not only Edison's insatiable curiosity, but his understanding of accumulating learning until critical mass is achieved. I hope this book will not only teach you about the process of formal and informal learning, but will propel you into the lifelong quest for knowledge, information, and wisdom. A person who has access to learning and remains ignorant is no better off than a hungry person presented with a banquet who starves to death.